Welcome, sophisticated viewer, to the opening reel of our cinematic historical audit, a grand deconstruction of the silver screen's most enduring historical fairy tales. For over a century, the flashing projectors of Hollywood have performed a masterful act of cultural alchemy, transforming the dusty, unglamorous realities of human history into highly polished, emotionally manipulative blockbusters. We begin our re-education in the sun-drenched valleys of ancient Greece, stepping over the glistening, oil-rubbed torsos of modern cinema to confront myth number one, the beloved fable that the Spartans were a flawless, liberty-loving band of 300 brothers in arms who marched out completely alone and entirely naked to defend global democracy at the hot gates of Thermopylae. This particular delusion has been enthusiastically peddled by directors who prefer comic book abs over actual historical texts. Let us introduce a heavy dose of classical reality. First and foremost, King Leonidas was not fighting alone with a mere handful of bodyguards. He was commanding a highly strategic coalition force that included at least 7,000 other Greek allies, including Thespians, Thebans, and hoplites from various city-states who bled and died alongside the Spartan elite. Furthermore, these men were not charging into battle clad in nothing but leather speedos and dramatic red capes. A real Spartan warrior was a walking tank, heavily encased in a massive bronze or layered linen cuirass, heavy bronze greaves, a terrifyingly restrictive Corinthian helmet, and carrying a massive, heavy wooden shield lined with bronze. But the most cynical lie of this cinematic myth is the political one. Hollywood loves to paint Sparta as a shining beacon of freedom standing against Eastern tyranny. In truth, the entire Spartan economy and military structure were exclusively supported by the brutal, systemic exploitation of the Helots, a massive domestic slave caste that outnumbered the actual Spartan citizens by nearly 7-1. The Spartans did not spend their days contemplating democracy. They spent them running a terrifyingly oppressive, militarized police state specifically designed to keep their enslaved neighbors from rising up and cutting their throats in the night. We cross the Mediterranean next to the bloody sands of the Roman Colosseum, where we must immediately dismantle the theatrical butchery of myth number two, the absolute certainty that Roman gladiators were forced to fight to the death in every single arena match, butchering each other by the thousands for the simple amusement of a bloodthirsty public. Action cinema has taught us that stepping onto the arena floor was an absolute death sentence, an unrelenting meat grinder where only one man walked out alive. If the Roman entertainment industry had actually operated under these ridiculous rules, it would have gone bankrupt within a single season. A gladiator was not a worthless, disposable slave tossed casually to the lions. He was a highly trained, meticulously conditioned, and exceptionally expensive corporate asset. The owners of gladiator academies, known as lanistas, invested immense fortunes into the housing, medical care, and specialized nutrition of these combatants, who were fed a high-carb, barley-based diet designed to create a thick layer of protective subcutaneous fat to insulate vital organs from superficial cuts. To throw away such an astronomical financial investment in every single 3-minute bout would be commercial suicide. Historical records and forensic analysis of gladiator cemeteries reveal that the vast majority of arena matches were highly regulated, strictly refereed sporting events, complete with complex rules, timeouts, and neutral officials who could stop a bout the moment a combatant was seriously injured or surrendered by raising a single finger. The survival rate in the arena was remarkably high, hovering well over 80 to 90%. These men were treated far less like doomed convicts and far more like modern, highly prized heavyweight prize fighters, possessing lucrative corporate sponsorships, fan clubs, and a team of the best doctors the empire could buy. While we are stranded in the Colosseum, we must also correct the physical vocabulary of the arena, turning our attention to myth number three, the universally accepted belief that the Roman emperor used a sharp, thumbs-down gesture to command the execution of a defeated gladiator, while a thumbs-up granted immediate mercy. This piece of theatrical sign language has become deeply embedded in our global culture, utilized by modern politicians and corporate executives alike to signal defeat or approval. This entire misconception rests upon a lazy 19th century translation error of the Latin phrase pollice verso, which literally translates to "with a turned thumb." The ancient Romans did not operate on our simplistic binary up or down system. When an imperial crowd, or the emperor himself, wished to grant a defeated fighter his life, they did not stick their thumbs in the air. Instead, they performed the gesture known as pollice compresso, compressing the thumb tightly inside the closed fist, hiding it from view to symbolize a sheathed sword, signaling that the victor should drop his weapon. Conversely, if the crowd deemed the fighter a coward who deserved execution, they would aggressively extend their thumb outward or turn it upward toward their own chest or throat, mimicking the physical thrust of a blade into the jugular. Hollywood simply flipped the anatomy because a downward thumb looked more visually intuitive to a modern movie audience, completely reversing centuries of Roman cultural tradition for the sake of a clean camera angle. We sail down the Nile next to encounter the ultimate historical seductress of the silver screen. Myth number 4. The legend that Cleopatra VII was a stunning, ethnically Egyptian supermodel who successfully conquered the Roman Empire using nothing but her flawless, exotic physical beauty. From the classic golden age of cinema to modern streaming documentaries, Cleopatra has been cast as a sultry, dark-haired enchantress of the Orient. Let us strip away the Hollywood makeup. To begin with, Cleopatra was not ethnically Egyptian at all. She was a pure-blooded Macedonian Greek, a direct descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's top military generals who seized control of Egypt centuries prior. Her family line was so aggressively insular that they spoke Greek exclusively, and Cleopatra was actually the very first member of her dynasty to bother learning the native Egyptian language. Furthermore, if you look at the contemporary coins minted during her actual reign, or the surviving marble busts of her likeness, you will not find the flawless features of a Hollywood starlet. Instead, you are greeted by a woman with a remarkably prominent, hooked nose, a sharp, protruding chin, and thin lips. The ancient historian Plutarch, who had access to first-hand accounts of her court, explicitly notes that her actual physical beauty was not entirely peerless or captivating on its own. Instead, Plutarch explains that her true, irresistible power lay in her towering intellect, her mastery of at least 9 languages, her profound understanding of statecraft, and her mesmerizing, melodic speaking voice, which he compared to a multi-stringed instrument. She did not conquer Julius Caesar and Mark Antony by fluttering her eyelashes. She conquered them because she was an absolute geopolitical mastermind who possessed a sharper administrative intellect than any Roman general she ever encountered. Returning to the realm of military strategy, we must confront the absurd wooden logistics of myth number 5, the timeless legend that the citizens of Troy blindly dragged a colossal wooden horse inside their impenetrable city walls without asking a single logical question, entirely unaware that a squad of armed Greek commandos was hiding inside its hollow belly. Hollywood loves to portray the ancient Trojans as the most monumental fools in military history, falling for a basic trick after successfully enduring a grueling 10-year siege. Let us apply basic mechanical and tactical scrutiny to this structural fable. There is absolutely zero contemporary archaeological evidence that a literal wooden horse ever rolled through the gates of Troy. The entire narrative originates from epic poetry written hundreds of years after the fact. From a practical standpoint, the logistics are completely ridiculous. Hiding a squad of fully armored, heavily sweating men inside a sealed, unventilated wooden container under the scorching Mediterranean sun for days, without anyone noticing the noise, the human waste, or the coughing, is a physical impossibility. Most modern classical historians and military archaeologists agree that if the horse existed at all, it was either a highly stylized description of a standard animal hide-covered battering ram used to breach the walls, or a poetic metaphor for an earthquake that shattered the city's defenses, given that Poseidon, the god of earthquakes, was traditionally symbolized by a horse. The Trojans were not undone by a lack of basic common sense. They were likely undone by structural engineering or tectonic shifts, which simply doesn't look as poetic on a movie poster. Finally, we confront the ultimate architectural injustice of the ancient world. Myth number 6. The deeply pervasive belief that millions of brutalized, whip-cracked Hebrew slaves built the Great Pyramids of Giza under the tyrannical oppression of a ruthless pharaoh. This image of thousands of starving laborers dragging multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert sands under a blazing sun, while Egyptian guards rain blows upon their backs, is a staple of cinematic religious epics. This entire narrative is a profound archaeological fabrication. For starters, the timing is completely wrong. The Great Pyramids were constructed during the Old Kingdom period, roughly around 2500 BC, which predates any historical or biblical mention of the Israelite presence in Egypt by nearly 1,000 years. More importantly, the extensive excavation of the Giza Plateau over the past few decades has uncovered the highly organized workers' villages that housed the pyramid builders. These men were not slaves. They were highly respected, skilled Egyptian laborers and seasonal agricultural workers who were recruited to work on national infrastructure projects during the annual flooding of the Nile. The archaeological record shows they were remarkably well housed, received elite medical care for their injuries, and were fed an incredibly luxurious diet that included massive daily rations of high-quality beef, sheep, goats, and fresh beer. They were so proud of their work that they organized themselves into competitive labor crews with colorful names like the Friends of Khufu, leaving behind graffiti that celebrated their unity. They were not building a monument to their own oppression. They were building a national monument to their state religion, and they were compensated handsomely for their sweat. We step out of the sun-bleached ruins of antiquity and plunge directly into the rain-soaked, mud-splattered landscape of the European Middle Ages for Part 2, a historical epoch that Hollywood has aggressively painted as a dismal, intellectual void populated exclusively by unwashed, hyper-violent simpletons. We begin by sailing north into the icy mist to confront the maritime fashion disaster of myth number 7, the absolute certainty that Viking raiders charged into battle wearing heavy iron helmets adorned with giant, sweeping animal horns or wings. This particular piece of Scandinavian millinery has become an inseparable part of our global pop culture vocabulary, turning every cinematic Norseman into a walking cattle display. Let us look at this from a basic tactical perspective. To wear giant, protruding handles on your head while engaging in brutal close-quarters shield wall combat would be an act of absolute military suicide. An enemy's battle axe or broadsword, instead of glancing harmlessly off a smooth iron dome, would immediately catch on those massive horns, wrenching the warrior's neck to the side and breaking his vertebrae instantly. Out of the tens of thousands of authentic Viking Age graves excavated across Europe, exactly 0 horned helmets have ever been discovered. Real Norse helmets were utilitarian, rounded iron bowls, often fitted with a simple nasal guard or a protective iron mask. This entire aesthetic was entirely manufactured in the late 19th century by costume designers like Carl Emil Doppler, who slapped horns onto the actors for Richard Wagner's epic opera productions, forever fusing German theatrical melodrama with actual history. From the battlefield, we step into the domestic quarters to wash away the filthy assumptions of myth number 8, the pervasive belief that medieval Europeans never bathed, spent their entire lives caked in layers of rotting grime, and genuinely believed that water was a toxic substance that would kill them upon contact. Cinema loves a dark, grey aesthetic where every peasant and king alike possesses dirt-smeared cheeks and greasy hair. This is a profound insult to medieval hygiene. While they certainly lacked indoor plumbing and modern pressurized showers, People in the Middle Ages were deeply, almost obsessively concerned with personal cleanliness. Throughout the medieval period, public bathhouses were incredibly popular social hubs in cities across Europe, where citizens gathered to soak in hot water, gossip, and eat. Medieval medical manuscripts are packed with detailed instructions on daily hygiene, explicitly commanding readers to wash their faces and hands with cold water every morning to clear out impurities, clean their teeth using rough linen cloths and powdered herbs, and comb their hair regularly. Because heavy woolen outer clothing was difficult to launder, they wore lightweight linen shifts and undergarments beneath their tunics, which acted as a sweat barrier and were washed constantly with lye soap. If you stepped into a medieval marketplace, you wouldn't be choked by the smell of rotting garbage. You would encounter a population that actively rinsed with flower-scented waters and scrubbed themselves clean. If the cinematic portrayal of their bodies is dirty, the portrayal of their societal laws is downright grotesque, leading us directly to the aristocratic perversion of myth number 9, the claim that cruel medieval lords routinely exercised the jus primae noctis, or the right of the first night, which supposedly granted a feudal master the legal right to deflower any peasant bride on her wedding night before her new husband could touch her. This shocking concept has served as a massive dramatic catalyst in historical epics, designed to make the audience instantly detest the tyrannical villains. However, if you scour the vast library of authentic medieval legal codes, court records, and estate registries across England, France, Germany, and Italy, you will find that this supposed law never actually existed. It is a complete historiographical ghost. The entire myth was largely invented by late medieval and Renaissance writers who were desperate to paint the preceding centuries as an era of absolute moral darkness, to make their own contemporary rulers look enlightened by comparison. While medieval lords certainly abused their power and exploited their serfs in numerous financial and physical ways, there was never a codified, legally sanctioned right to institutionalized sexual assault built into the feudal fabric of European society. We must also recalculate the demographic mathematics of the era to dismantle the mathematical distortion of myth number 10, the widespread belief that the average life expectancy in medieval times was 30 years old, meaning that anyone who managed to reach their late 20s was an ancient, decaying grandparent standing on the very edge of the grave. Hollywood loves to populate its historical villages with frantic teenagers, because presumably everyone else has already dropped dead of old age. This is a complete failure to understand how statistical averages work. The low average life expectancy of the period was entirely driven by a staggering, heartbreaking infant mortality rate, where roughly 1/3 of all children died before the age of 5 due to childhood illnesses, infections, and lack of modern antibiotics. Once a human being successfully navigated the perilous minefield of early childhood and reached the age of puberty, their biological prospects changed dramatically. A medieval person who made it to their 20th birthday had a perfectly normal statistical probability of living a long, productive life, routinely surviving well into their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Kings, bishops, monks, and ordinary farmers frequently lived to ripe old ages, their hair turning grey, just like ours, completely unbothered by the fact that modern statistics had supposedly booked them for an early departure. Our journey through medieval misconceptions takes a dark turn into the chambers of religious panic to address the grand inquisitorial illusions of myth number 11, the belief that the Spanish Inquisition hunted down and burned millions of innocent, traditional women at the stake for practicing witchcraft. The image of a sinister, hooded Catholic monk torturing a peasant woman before tossing her into a raging bonfire is a foundational text of modern historical cinema. This narrative completely misidentifies both the perpetrators and the timeline. First, the Spanish Inquisition had virtually no interest in witches. Their strict mandate was to root out religious heresy among converted populations. In fact, Spanish inquisitors were famously skeptical of witchcraft claims, view the belief in night-flying hags as an uneducated, superstitious delusion, and routinely threw out witchcraft cases due to a complete lack of empirical evidence. Second, the vast, tragic wave of witch trials did not occur during the dark medieval period at all. It was a phenomenon of the early modern period and the Renaissance, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries. Furthermore, the overwhelming majority of these trials and subsequent executions were conducted not by the Catholic Church or religious courts, but by secular, local magistrates in Protestant regions of Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland. Finally, we pull up a chair to the banquet table to scrape away the unappetizing assumptions of myth number 12, the claim that medieval food was completely bland, entirely unseasoned, and frequently rotten, with wealthy lords throwing handfuls of heavy salt and spices onto green, decaying meat simply to disguise the putrid flavor. Cinema always portrays historical meals as a dismal affair of grey gruel and unidentifiable charred joints. In reality, the medieval upper classes were profoundly obsessed with complex, highly vibrant culinary arts. The global spice trade was a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar economic engine, driving merchants across thousands of miles to secure precious cargoes of black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and saffron. If a wealthy medieval lord could afford these astronomically expensive imports, the very last thing he would do is waste them on rotten meat. Furthermore, medieval cities possessed incredibly strict urban food safety laws. Municipal inspectors routinely patrolled marketplaces, and the penalties for a butcher selling spoiled, tainted, or unwholesome meat included massive fines, public humiliation in the pillory, and having the offending rotten meat burned directly under their nose. Medieval recipes from surviving cookbooks reveal a cuisine that was intensely flavorful, complex, and brightly colored, utilizing verjuice, almond milk, and fresh herbs to create sophisticated, sweet and savory flavor profiles that would put a modern fine dining restaurant to shame. We return once more to the enduring theater of medieval misconceptions for part 3, aiming our intellectual artillery directly at the heavy steel fortifications of myth number 13. The ridiculous, slapstick notion that a medieval knight in full plate armor was a clumsy, top-heavy metal statue who was so utterly incapacitated by his own defense that if he were knocked to the ground, he would lie there flailing like a flipped turtle, requiring an industrial crane to hoist his bulky frame back onto his horse. Hollywood directors absolutely love this gag, using it to inject comic relief into historical battles by showing armored men lumbering about like deep-sea divers. Let us apply basic military engineering and physics to this metallurgical marvel. Full Gothic plate armor was not a crude collection of heavy iron stovepipes strapped to a man's limbs. It was a masterpiece of articulated, custom-fitted engineering. A complete suit of high-quality steel armor weighed between 45 and 55 pounds. To put that into perspective, that is significantly lighter than the standard combat load carried by a modern infantry soldier or the heavy turnout gear worn by a municipal firefighter. Crucially, while a modern backpack concentrates its weight exclusively on the shoulders and spine, a knight's plate armor was meticulously distributed across the entire skeletal frame via a system of padded undergarments, leather straps, and load-bearing rivets. A knight in customized plate armor did not stumble around blindly. He possessed near-complete range of motion, able to perform cartwheels, execute full sprints, vault over obstacles, and spring up from a prone position on the ground in a fraction of a second without any assistance whatsoever. If you tried to use a crane to load him onto his destrier, he would likely use his exceptional mobility to take your head off with a poleaxe. From the functional realities of armor, we transition into the sensationalized horrors of myth number 14, the grim, spike-lined nightmare of the Iron Maiden, a vertical sarcophagus supposedly used throughout the Middle Ages to slowly and agonizingly pierce a victim's vital organs while keeping them alive for days. This horrific apparatus is a mandatory fixture in cinematic torture chambers and Gothic horror films, designed to show just how sadistic our ancestors truly were. However, if you examine the entire documentary record of medieval judicial punishments, royal executions, and penal codes, you will discover that the Iron Maiden is a complete and absolute 19th century hoax. Not a single genuine Iron Maiden existed during the Middle Ages. The very first one was cobbled together in the late 1700s and early 1800s by showmen and imaginative antiquarians who literally welded together fragments of old iron shields, padlocks, and random spikes to create a sensational museum exhibit. They knew that a public obsessed with romantic Gothic horror would pay handsomely to see proof of medieval barbarism. These fraudulent contraptions were deliberately backdated and placed in castles to titillate tourists, creating a historical lie out of thin air to feed a modern appetite for historical sensationalism. If the cinematic portrayal of their technology is twisted, the portrayal of their basic cosmic understanding is even more uneducated, leading us directly to the intellectual distortion of myth number 15, the claim that people in the Middle Ages universally believed the Earth was completely flat, shivering in fear that if they sailed too far into the Atlantic, their ships would plunge off the physical edge of the cosmos. Hollywood loves to use this fable to frame Christopher Columbus as a lonely, enlightened genius fighting against a wall of superstitious, flat Earth churchmen. This narrative is a complete historical fabrication. The continuous, unbroken consensus among medieval scholars, theologians, the Catholic Church, and ordinary sailors was that the Earth was an absolute sphere. This physical fact had been mathematically proven by the ancient Greeks and was never forgotten by European intelligentsia. Every major medieval university curriculum included the study of astronomy and geography based on spherical models. In fact, one of the most common symbols of royal authority held by medieval monarchs in their portraits was the globus cruciger, a literal golden sphere representing the Earth topped by a cross. The fierce debate between Columbus and the royal geographers in Spain was not about the shape of the Earth at all. It was entirely about its size. The royal experts correctly calculated that the globe was far too massive for Columbus's tiny ships to survive a direct voyage to Asia, while Columbus naively cooked his books, underestimating the Earth's circumference by thousands of miles. Had the Americas not been sitting there as an accidental geographical cushion, Columbus and his crew would have starved to death in the middle of a spherical ocean. We return to the mechanics of the medieval battlefield to puncture the ballistic exaggerations of myth number 16, the glorious legend that an English archer wielding a yew longbow could effortlessly pierce full steel plate armor from hundreds of yards away, turning noble French knights into human pincushions at battles like Agincourt. Action cinema loves to show volleys of arrows slicing through thick metal chest plates as if they were made of damp cardboard. Let us look at the actual terminal ballistics and metallurgy. High-quality late medieval plate armor was constructed from hardened, low-carbon steel, specifically contoured with sloped, rounded surfaces engineered to deflect incoming kinetic energy. When modern experimental archaeologists and metallurgists fire heavy war arrows from authentic 150-pound longbows at reproduction steel breastplates, the results are clear. The arrows bounce off harmlessly, shatter upon impact, or merely leave a superficial scratch. A direct, head-on strike to a solid piece of plate armor simply cannot penetrate the steel. The devastating effectiveness of the English longbow at Agincourt and Crécy did not come from arrows punching through breastplates. It came from a relentless, terrifying hail of arrows that targeted the unarmored horses, panicked the cavalry, and slipped through the tiny, vulnerable gaps in the armor, such as the eye slits, the armpits, and the groin joints. The archers did not shoot through the armor. They shot between it, winning the day through tactical positioning, muddy terrain, and volume of fire rather than mythical armor-piercing capabilities. Our deconstruction continues by stripping the moral varnish off myth number 17, the romantic fantasy that chivalry was a beautiful, egalitarian code of noble conduct that forced medieval knights to act as selfless, honorable protectors of the poor, the weak, and the defenseless. Hollywood has wrapped the knight in a shroud of pure white righteousness, framing him as a medieval superhero dedicated to social justice. In stark reality, chivalry was an exclusive, high-class military contract designed solely to govern relationships between members of the wealthy nobility. The rules of chivalry were explicitly engineered to prevent elite aristocratic knights from permanently killing each other on the battlefield, ensuring instead that they could be captured alive and held for massive, lucrative family ransoms. The code said absolutely nothing about protecting the common peasant. To the chivalric knight, the ordinary farming serfs were not human beings deserving of dignity. They were mere economic property. When a knight engaged in a chevauchée, a standard medieval military strategy of total war, their explicit objective was to march through enemy territory, deliberately burning peasant villages, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and massacring the defenseless local populace to starve out the rival lord. Chivalry was not a shield for the weak, it was a luxury country club agreement for the heavily armed ruling class. Finally, we smash the supreme chronological insult of myth number 18, the sweeping label of the Dark Ages, the absolute conviction that the entire millennium following the collapse of the Roman Empire was an era of total intellectual stagnation, scientific vacuum, and zero human progress. Cinema loves to show this era as a perpetual twilight of ignorance where humanity did nothing but wallow in filth for 1,000 years. This is a profound academic slander. The so-called Dark Ages was actually one of the most intensely innovative and technologically transformative eras in human history. This period witnessed the structural engineering marvels of the great Gothic cathedrals, buildings that pushed stone architecture to heights that rival modern skyscrapers. It saw the literal birth of the university system across Europe, establishing institutional centers of critical debate, law, and natural philosophy that still exist today. On a practical level, medieval engineers revolutionized human labor by developing advanced watermills and windmills that mechanized industry, inventing the mechanical clock to precisely measure time, creating the three-field crop rotation system that triggered an agricultural boom, and inventing spectacles to double the working lifespan of literate scholars. Far from a static void of ignorance, the Middle Ages laid the exact intellectual and mechanical foundations that made the Renaissance and the modern world possible. We hoist anchor now upon the turbulent, salt-water-soaked horizons of the 17th and 18th centuries for Part 4, turning our critical lens toward the high seas and the grand imperial courts where gunpowder smoke and royal propaganda have thoroughly obscured the facts. We begin on the rolling decks of the golden age of piracy to correct the ocular architecture of myth number 19, the universally cherished belief that pirates wore black leather eye patches exclusively because they were a shockingly clumsy pack of swashbucklers who were constantly losing eyes to flying splinters and brutal cutlass duels. Hollywood has transformed the eye patch into a mandatory pirate fashion accessory, an immediate shorthand for nautical villainy. Let us look beneath the leather to discover a brilliant piece of practical naval technology. The eye patch was not a medical bandage, it was a tactical tool for dark adaptation. A sailor's duties required them to constantly shift between the blinding, sun-bleached glare of the upper deck and the pitch-black, unlit caverns of the ship's lower holds to retrieve gunpowder, cargo, or supplies. The human eye requires up to 20 to 30 minutes to fully adjust from brilliant sunlight to near total darkness. By keeping one eye permanently covered beneath a patch, a pirate could jump down a hatch into the dark belly of a vessel, flip the patch to the other side, and instantly see with perfect clarity with their pre-adjusted eye, ready to fight or work without a moment of blindness. It was an ingenious way to survive a tactical ambush in the dark, entirely unrelated to a lack of depth perception. While we are stranded in the Caribbean, we must also throw overboard the theatrical dramatics of myth number 20, the iconic image of captive victims being forced by cackling pirates to walk a wooden plank blindfolded, stepping out over the edge of the vessel into a churning sea of hungry sharks. This particular piece of nautical theatre is the emotional centerpiece of nearly every pirate film ever produced, but if you search the vast ocean of genuine Admiralty court records, logbooks, and pirate trials, you will find that walking the plank is a complete literary invention, popularized by 19th-century fiction writers like Robert Louis Stevenson. Real Golden Age pirates were driven by cold, calculated efficiency and psychological terror, and they had absolutely no use for slow, theatrical diving boards. If a pirate crew wanted to dispose of a troublesome captive, they did not waste time chanting around a wooden beam. They simply picked the individual up and tossed them cleanly over the railing in a fraction of a second. If they desired a more drawn-out, agonizing punishment to extract information or exact revenge, they utilized far more brutal historical methods, such as marooning the victim completely alone on a desolate, waterless sandbar, keel-hauling them by dragging them beneath the barnacle-encrusted hull of the moving ship to shred their flesh, or forcing them to run circles around the mainmast for hours while being pricked with spears in a torture known as sweating. We march inland next to the grand imperial battlefields of Europe to shrink the colossal anatomical distortions of myth number 21, the absolute geopolitical certainty that Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was an exceptionally tiny, vertically challenged man who suffered from a deep psychiatric insecurity, conquering the entire European continent solely to compensate for his diminutive stature. This concept has become so deeply embedded in our psychological lexicon that we have literally named an inferiority complex after him. This entire historical slander is the result of a basic math error combined with highly effective wartime propaganda. When Napoleon died in exile, his official autopsy recorded his height as 5 feet 2 inches. However, this measurement was taken using French inches, which was significantly larger than British standard inches. When you accurately convert those imperial French units into modern standard measurements, Napoleon's actual physical height was roughly 5 feet 7 inches. For the early 19th century, 5 feet 7 inches was not short at all. It was perfectly average, if not slightly taller than the average French peasant of his era. The enduring myth of the tiny emperor was aggressively manufactured by British caricature artists like James Gillray, who deliberately drew Napoleon as a petulant, microscopic child in a giant uniform to mock his imperial ambitions, creating a piece of psychological warfare so effective that it outlived the empire itself. We remain within the revolutionary fires of France to silence the arrogant culinary cruelty of myth number 22. The infamous accusation that Queen Marie Antoinette, upon being informed that the starving, impoverished peasants of Paris had absolutely no bread to eat, cynically and callously snarled the phrase, "Let them eat cake." This quote has served for generations as the ultimate historical symbol of aristocratic detachment and royal oblivion, supposedly justifying the swift drop of the guillotine blade. In reality, Marie Antoinette never uttered these words. The exact phrase first appears in the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiographical work, Confessions, where he attributes the quote to a generic great princess. Crucially, Rousseau wrote this passage around 1765, when Marie Antoinette was a mere 9-year-old child living far away in Austria, long before she ever set foot in the Kingdom of France. The line was a pre-existing piece of anti-royalist political folklore that was later deliberately and systematically weaponized by French revolutionary pamphleteers to blacken the young queen's reputation and whip the public into a bloodthirsty frenzy. Marie Antoinette's actual private correspondence reveals a woman who was deeply concerned by the rising cost of flour, actively writing to her family about the profound moral duty of the monarchy to aid the starving lower classes during times of famine. We shift our focus to the mechanics of early modern warfare to correct the ballistic slander of myth number 23, the claim that early smoothbore military muskets, like the famous British Brown Bess, were so wildly inaccurate and mechanically useless that a soldier couldn't hit a target as large as a house from a distance of a mere 50 yards. Hollywood loves to show historical soldiers firing massive clouds of smoke while absolutely nothing is hit, framing ancient black powder battles as a game of pure luck. This completely misinterprets the entire doctrine of 18th century linear tactics. A smoothbore musket lacked the spiral rifling lines that stabilize a modern bullet, meaning the round lead ball would bounce erratically down the barrel and emerge with unpredictable aerodynamics. Individually, yes, it was an imprecise weapon at long ranges, but armies did not fight as individuals. They fought in massive, tightly packed, multi-ranked lines of hundreds of men, firing simultaneously in devastating synchronized volleys at distances of less than 50 to 70 yards. At that close proximity, a wall of hundreds of high-caliber lead balls traveling at supersonic speeds did not need to be individually aimed. It acted like a colossal, industrial-scale shotgun blast, tearing through enemy formations with horrific, bone-shattering kinetic energy. Furthermore, historical military tests show that a well-trained soldier could in fact consistently hit an individual human-sized target within 50 yards. Linear warfare was a cold, calculated exercise in psychological discipline and massed volume of fire, not a blind shot in the dark. Finally, we cross blades with the theatrical choreography of myth number 24, the romantic belief that medieval and Renaissance sword duels were long, elegant, highly acrobatic dances featuring endless minutes of musical blade clashing, dramatic spins, and polite pauses for philosophical dialogue. Action cinema has conditioned us to believe that a real sword fight is a beautiful, rhythmic display of athletic coordination. If you study the actual surviving combat manuals left behind by historical European martial arts masters such as Fiore de Liberi or Johannes Lichtenauer, you will find that a real duel was a brutal, terrifying, and lightning-fast affair that was usually over in a matter of seconds. Swords were not used like metal baseball bats to aggressively smash against each other. Constant blade clashing quickly dulled the edges and structurally weakened the steel. Real historical combat was deeply centered on leverage, grappling, and immediate physical violence. A duel frequently involved binding the opponent's weapon, punching them directly in the face with a heavy steel pommel, sweeping their legs to throw them into the mud, or using a technique called half-swording, gripping the literal bare metal of your own blade with your gloved hand to transform the sword into a precise, short-range spear to drive into the eye slit of an opponent's helmet. It was an unglamorous, highly efficient science of survival, where the man who tried a dramatic, cinematic spin would immediately find a 3-foot piece of steel buried deep in his spine. We saddle up now and ride directly into the sun-baked, dust-choked landscape of the American frontier for Part 5, a historic era that Hollywood has thoroughly repackaged into an epic, mythological landscape populated by hyper-masculine folklore. We begin on the dirt roads of our imagination to dismantle the ultimate frontier trope. Myth number 25, the absolute certainty that the Wild West was dominated by dramatic, highly honorable, quick-draw duels where two gunslingers squared off face-to-face on the main street at high noon, while the townspeople hid behind closed shutters. This pristine cinematic ritual is the emotional backbone of nearly every Western film ever produced. In the cold, unromantic light of historical record, the classic quick-draw duel is an absolute fiction. Professional historians have scanned thousands of frontier newspapers, court dockets, and pioneer journals, and have found that face-to-face, quick-draw showdowns almost never occurred. Real frontier gunfights were rare, exceptionally clumsy, and profoundly dishonorable affairs. They were not exercises in athletic reflexes. They were chaotic, drunken back-alley brawls, sudden ambushes from behind cover, or point-blank executions in the dim, smoky corners of crowded saloons where both parties were too intoxicated to aim straight. The legendary lawman, Wild Bill Hickok, did not win his reputation through lightning-fast reflexes on a sunny street. He won it by taking careful, deliberate aim from a safe distance, and he ultimately met his end by being shot in the back of the head while playing poker. This theatrical lawlessness brings us directly to the systemic civil misconceptions of myth number 26, the belief that every single man, woman, and child on the American frontier was heavily armed at all times, transforming frontier settlements into lawless, bullet-riddled murder zones where the only law was the iron in your holster. Hollywood loves to paint these towns as an absolute libertarian free-for-all. Let us examine the actual municipal ordinances of the Old West. If you traveled back in time and attempted to ride your horse into famous frontier boom towns like Tombstone, Arizona, or Dodge City, Kansas, during their peak years, you would be met at the city limits by a giant sign and a very serious town marshal demanding that you immediately hand over your firearms. Frontier towns actually possessed some of the strictest gun control laws in American history. Carrying an open or concealed firearm within municipal boundaries was entirely illegal for ordinary citizens. You were legally required to check your pistols at the local sheriff's office or the Grand Hotel clerk's desk the moment you arrived. Furthermore, the historical homicide rates in these frontier communities were remarkably low, often averaging fewer than half a dozen murders per year. As for those legendary explosive bank robberies that populate the cinematic landscape, they were so structurally and logistically rare that historians have documented fewer than a dozen actual bank heists across the entire western frontier over a 40-year period. It turns out that keeping your money in a town packed with armed professional lawmen was safer than Hollywood cares to admit. If the cinematic portrayal of their civic laws is a lie, the portrayal of their basic daily wardrobe is downright ridiculous, leading us directly to the millenary delusions of myth number 27. The absolute rule that all Golden Age cowboys and frontier pioneers spent their days wearing the classic, wide-brimmed Stetson cowboy hat seen in modern Western cinema. We have been conditioned to believe that you couldn't herd cattle without a giant, perfectly creased piece of felt on your head. However, if you examine the vast archive of authentic, late 19th century frontier photography, you will be greeted by a remarkably different sartorial reality. The overwhelming majority of actual working cowboys, railroad laborers, and frontier merchants did not wear cowboy hats at all. Instead, they wore bowler hats, derbies, or simple cloth flat caps. The bowler hat was actually the most popular headwear on the American frontier by an astronomical margin. Working men preferred the bowler because its tight, rounded, low-profile design fit snugly onto the skull, meaning it wouldn't easily fly off their heads when riding a horse at full gallop or working in the fierce, unrelenting prairie winds. The giant, oversized Stetson hat was largely a luxury item popularized at the very end of the century by theatrical Wild West touring shows and early silent films, transforming a rare piece of specialty gear into a manufactured uniform for a historical era that had already passed. We return to the mechanics of frontier criminality to derail the ballistic exaggerations of myth number 28, the thrilling legend that outlaws and bandits routinely hijacked and robbed moving steam trains by galloping their horses alongside the accelerating locomotive, matching its speed, and performing a daring, acrobatic leap from the saddle onto the moving metal stairs of the train car. This is a mandatory action sequence in cinematic westerns designed to show the death-defying athleticism of frontier criminals. Let us apply basic physics and animal biology to this locomotive heist. Attempting to force a living horse to gallop at top speed directly adjacent to a roaring iron steam engine that is belching blinding black smoke, deafening noise and hot sparks, is an absolute biological impossibility. The animal's natural survival instincts would cause it to panic and veer away instantly. Furthermore, the mechanical reality of matching speeds on uneven, rocky prairie terrain makes a physical jump from a saddle to a train car a guaranteed recipe for falling beneath the heavy iron wheels to be instantly bisected. Real historical train robberies were far more mundane and logistically calculated. Outlaws never chased moving trains. Instead, they waited until the locomotive was stationary at an isolated water refueling station, or they deliberately sabotaged the iron rails beforehand, blocked the tracks with heavy boulders, or flipped the railroad switches to force the train to a dead stop before they ever drew a weapon. Our deconstruction crosses into the complex landscape of frontier geopolitics to correct the deeply harmful cultural slander of myth number 29, the narrative that Native Americans were entirely aggressive, bloodthirsty savages who spent their days hiding behind ridges, waiting to launch unprovoked, murderous ambushes on peaceful, defenseless pioneer wagon trains. For decades, Hollywood utilizing the Indian attack as a cheap, dramatic plot device to build tension. The actual historical logs kept by the pioneers themselves tell a completely different story of cross-cultural interaction. The overwhelming majority of encounters between westward-bound wagon trains and native tribes were entirely peaceful, rooted in commerce, trade, and mutual cooperation. Native Americans frequently acted as vital guides, helping the pioneers navigate treacherous river crossings, trading fresh bison meat and horses for manufacturing goods, and providing critical geographical intelligence. In fact, out of the hundreds of thousands of settlers who traveled the historic Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, a fraction of 1% were ever involved in hostile encounters with native populations. A pioneer traveler was infinitely more likely to die from the crushing realities of disease like cholera, drowning during an unmanaged river crossing, or accidentally shooting themselves with their own poorly handled firearms than they were to ever see an arrow fired in anger. Finally, we dismantle the mechanical infallibility of the frontier's favorite tool. Myth number 30. The claim that the famous Colt single-action army revolver, the legendary Peacemaker, was a flawlessly reliable, perfectly safe weapon that every frontier scout and cowboy could fire with surgical accuracy straight from the hip without using the sights. Cinema has transformed this revolver into a magical extension of the human hand. Let us look at the crude mechanical reality of 19th century firearms engineering. The original Colt revolver lacked any form of modern internal safety block or hammer drop protection. If a cowboy carried a fully loaded cylinder with 6 rounds in the chambers, the heavy steel hammer would rest directly on the live primer of the 6th bullet. If they dropped the gun, bumped it against a saloon table, or their horse bucked violently, the hammer would drop, causing the weapon to instantly discharge directly into the cowboy's own thigh or foot. Because of this lethal mechanical flaw, anyone with basic common sense carried only 5 rounds in their revolver, keeping the hammer resting safely on an empty chamber. Furthermore, firing a single-action revolver from the hip was a guaranteed way to miss your target completely. The heavy recoil, black powder smoke, and terrible ergonomics meant that hitting anything further than 5 feet away required bringing the weapon up to eye level and utilizing the iron sights. We step out of the dusty frontier and march directly into the thunderous, smoke-choked landscape of the 20th century for Part 6, an era of mass media, global conflict, and industrial-scale propaganda where historical facts are routinely manufactured, packaged, and distributed for political convenience and theatrical drama. We begin within the jazz-fueled, bullet-riddled streets of the Roaring Twenties to dismantle the absolute economic and social certainty of myth number 31, the universal belief that prohibition in 1920s America was a complete, comical, and utter failure that actually caused a massive net increase in national alcohol consumption. Hollywood loves to paint the Volstead era as one continuous, champagne-soaked party hosted by Al Capone, where every citizen in America simply bypassed the law by sliding into a glamorous underground speakeasy. Let us look past the Tommy guns to examine the actual public health data. While Prohibition unquestionably gave rise to organized crime and administrative corruption, it was a staggering statistical success from a public health perspective. The very moment the law took effect, overall national alcohol consumption plummeted by an astonishing 60%. Hospital admissions for acute alcohol poisoning dropped off a cliff. Arrests for public drunkenness hit historic lows, and the national rate of deaths related to liver cirrhosis declined by more than half, a health benefit that did not fully return to its pre-prohibition levels for several decades after the law was repealed. Prohibition did not make America wetter, it made the nation significantly drier, transforming a ubiquitous social habit into an expensive, highly inconvenient luxury for the criminal elite. From the economic battlefields of America, we fly across the Pacific to confront the tragic, high-altitude psychology of myth number 32, the pervasive narrative that Japanese kamikaze pilots during the twilight of World War II were entirely brainwashed, uneducated, illiterate teenagers who were physically forced into their cockpits at gunpoint by fanatical military handlers. War cinema routinely portrays these men as unthinking, faceless drones, stripped of all human individuality. The surviving historical journals, letters home, and military records paint a far more complex and profoundly tragic intellectual picture. The overwhelming majority of the Special Attack Corps pilots were not uneducated children. They were the intellectual elite of the nation, recruited directly from the classrooms of prestigious imperial universities. They were highly literate, deeply philosophical young men who spent their final nights reading Western philosophy, classical literature, and poetry, wrestling intensely with their impending mortality. Their journals reveal that they were acutely aware of Japan's inevitable military defeat, choosing to volunteer not out of mindless, blind fanaticism, but out of a deep, agonizing, and tragic sense of filial duty to protect their mothers, sisters, and homeland from an impending ground invasion. Furthermore, if a pilot expressed genuine psychological doubt or intellectual opposition to the program during training, they were not executed. They were quietly grounded or reassigned to conventional units because the High Command knew that hitting a moving warship required absolute voluntary concentration. Returning to the domestic front of media manipulation, we must deflate the screaming headlines of myth number 33, the legendary claim that Orson Welles' infamous 1938 radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds caused immediate nationwide mass hysteria, sparking wild riots in the streets, mass evacuations, and filled hospitals with terrified citizens convinced that Martians were genuinely invading New Jersey. This is a favorite fable of media historians, designed to show the dangerous power of early broadcasting. In reality, the supposed nationwide panic was almost entirely an invention of the print newspaper industry. On the night of the broadcast, the vast majority of the American public was not even listening to Orson Welles. They were tuned in to the highly popular Edgar Bergen Comedy Hour on a rival network. Telephone logs and radio rating surveys from that exact evening show that fewer than 2% of listeners genuinely mistook the dramatic play for a real news bulletin. The following morning, mainstream newspapers, which were terrified of losing their advertising revenue to the rapidly rising medium of radio journalism, deliberately fabricated and aggressively sensationalized stories of mass panic to discredit radio as an irresponsible, dangerous platform for news, transforming a brilliantly performed radio drama into a manufactured national emergency. We plunge into the icy depths of the North Atlantic next to steer past the maritime cinematic errors of myth number 34, the absolute rule that the Titanic sank entirely because its arrogant captain was recklessly speeding through a known ice field at maximum velocity solely to break a glamorous transatlantic luxury speed record for the morning newspapers. Every cinematic retelling portrays Captain Smith as a corporate puppet, bowing to commercial pressure. Let us look at the mechanical blueprints and maritime protocols of 1912. The Titanic was never physically capable of breaking any speed records. It was explicitly engineered for massive size, unparalleled luxury, and stable comfort, possessing a top speed that was significantly slower than the smaller, faster Mauretania, which held the blue-ribboned record by a wide margin. Furthermore, maintaining a high speed through a known ice field was not reckless amateurism. It was the standard, universally accepted protocol among all Edwardian maritime captains, operating under the assumption that on a clear, calm night, the lookouts would spot an iceberg from miles away, allowing plenty of time to turn the ship. The tragedy was not born of unprecedented speed, but of an incredibly rare combination of an exceptionally calm sea that left no white foam at the base of the ice, a lack of binoculars for the lookouts, and a fatal structural vulnerability in the brittle steel rivets that simply unzipped under the immense hydrostatic pressure of the impact. Our journey through modern myths brings us to the financial asphalt of Manhattan to smash the suicidal legends of myth number 35. The widespread belief that the Wall Street crash of October 1929 caused an immediate, unprecedented wave of ruined, bankrupt stockbrokers and wealthy bankers jumping out of skyscraper windows to their deaths. This grim image of bodies raining onto the pavements of New York has become a universal visual metaphor for economic collapse. However, if you examine the actual mortality statistics compiled by the New York City Chief Medical Examiner's Office for the months of October and November 1929, you will find that the suicide rate by jumping did not spike at all. The entire myth was popularized within days of the crash by cynical contemporary comedians like Will Rogers and sensationalist tabloid press outlets that eagerly reported rumors of bodies piling up on Wall Street to sell more papers. While there were certainly a handful of tragic suicides among prominent financiers following the market collapse, the vast majority of those individuals utilized traditional, quiet methods at home. They were not performing high-altitude acrobatics for the public, but Hollywood preferred the dramatic aerial visuals because a quiet economic tragedy doesn't fill a theater seat. Finally, we dismantle the immaculate political sainthood of myth number 36, the absolute conviction that Prime Minister Winston Churchill was a universally adored, flawless British saviour who always maintained the absolute, unyielding love and support of his country throughout the duration of the war. Modern cinema has wrapped Churchill in a thick blanket of pure, unnuanced patriotism. In the cold light of Westminster politics, Churchill was a deeply divisive, controversial, and often intensely disliked figure. Before the war, he was widely viewed by the British working class as an erratic, untrustworthy imperialist who had catastrophically mismanaged the Gallipoli campaign in World War I and deployed troops against striking miners. Even during his peak wartime leadership, his domestic policies were heavily criticized, and the public frequently booed his appearances in bombed-out neighborhoods. The absolute proof of this political reality arrived in July 1945, a mere 2 months after Germany surrendered. In the general election, the British electorate did not reward their wartime savior. Instead, they handed Churchill and his party a shocking landslide defeat, throwing him out of office in favor of the Labour Party because the British public wanted a modern welfare state, not a romantic imperialist warrior. We arrive at the final reel of our historical audit, the grand cinematic culmination where we tear down the last remaining stage curtains of Hollywood illusion and confront the singular, ultimate truth of human mythology. We begin our final chapter in the damp, subterranean dungeons of 17th century France to unlock the rusty hinges of myth number 37, the tragic, claustrophobic legend of the man in the iron mask, an enigmatic royal prisoner who supposedly spent decades locked inside a brutal, heavy iron helmet that was permanently riveted to his skull, left to rust against his skin as punishment for an unmentionable secret. This haunting image has been an absolute goldmine for historical cinema, symbolizing the absolute cruelty of the Bourbon monarchy. Let us consult the actual archival prison ledgers and the contemporary letters written by the prison governor, Sam Mars. The mysterious prisoner did either wear a mask during transport to prevent public identification, but it was absolutely not made of iron. It was a mask constructed from smooth, high-quality black velvet, fitted with comfortable silk ties to ensure the prisoner could breathe, eat, and speak with complete ease. The iron element was a pure piece of romantic exaggeration cooked up years later by the philosopher Voltaire to drum up anti-royalist sentiment, a literary fiction that was subsequently cemented into our global pop culture consciousness by the novelist Alexandre Dumas. The prisoner was actually treated with remarkable care and luxury behind closed doors, enjoying fine wines and delicate linens, completely unbothered by the fictional rust that Hollywood would later splash across his face. We cross the Sea of Japan next to infiltrate the shadowy, midnight corridors of feudal history to strip the wardrobe away from myth number 38, the absolute certainty that historical ninjas always operated while clad in tight, pitch-black pajamas, matching fabric masks, and carrying swords strapped squarely to their backs to blend seamlessly into the night shadows. Cinema has transformed this monochrome uniform into an immutable historical law. Let us apply basic visual physics and tactical common sense to this espionage fable. If you step out into an open field under a bright, natural moonlight while wearing a solid, pitch-black outfit, you do not become invisible. Instead, you form a sharp, high-contrast, deep black silhouette that stands out glaringly against the ambient natural night sky, making you an exceptionally easy target for an alert guard. The historical shinobi were master espionage agents, and their primary weapon was not martial arts, but social camouflage. They did not wear ridiculous matching pajamas. Instead, they dressed as ordinary local peasants, humble rice farmers, traveling merchants, or itinerant Buddhist monks. By blending seamlessly into the everyday, mundane crowds of the marketplace or the castle town, they could gather critical intelligence, map out fortifications, and plant poison without ever raising an eyebrow. The iconic all-black ninja uniform was actually a theatrical convention stolen directly from traditional Japanese puppet theatre, where stagehands wore solid black outfits to signal to the audience that they were invisible characters, a visual trick that Hollywood naively copied and sold to a gullible world as authentic military history. While we are stranded in feudal Japan, we must also blunt the pristine, razor-sharp moral edge of myth number 39. The romantic fantasy that the legendary samurai were entirely flawless, hyper-honorable martial artists who lived and died exclusively by a strict, unyielding moral code known as Bushido, cheerfully preferring slow starvation or ritual suicide over breaking a promise or engaging in a dirty tactical maneuver. Cinema has wrapped the samurai in a shroud of mystical righteousness, framing them as knights of pure discipline. In the cold, bloody reality of medieval Japanese warfare, the samurai were deeply pragmatic, highly calculating military professionals who operated on the exact same rules of survival as any European mercenary. They did not view warfare as a spiritual poetry contest. They viewed it as a high-stakes business enterprise. Historical records show that samurai routinely switched alliances in the middle of a battle if a rival warlord offered a higher payout, stabbed their own blood relatives in the back to seize control of family land, utilized massive volleys of early European firearms to slaughter traditional charging cavalry, and relied heavily on nighttime ambushes, deception, and sudden political assassination whenever it was economically efficient. The absolute, unbending code of Bushido was largely a peacetime ideological invention cooked up during the long, boring years of the Edo period to keep an underemployed, heavily armed warrior class from tearing the country apart out of sheer boredom. a piece of romantic state propaganda that modern media has enthusiastically transformed into a spiritual truth. We return to the drawing rooms of Western civilization to unpack the structural medical exaggerations of myth number 40, the widespread belief that Victorian women routinely fainted onto dedicated couches because their tight-laced corsets were mechanical instruments of patriarchal torture that permanently crushed their soft internal organs, shattered their lower ribs, and reduced their breathing capacity to near zero. Hollywood loves to show a breathless heroine being violently cinched into a dress while gasping for air. Let us examine the actual physical artifacts of 19th-century textile engineering. For the overwhelming majority of everyday Victorian women, the corset was a highly supportive, practical foundational undergarment that functioned precisely like a modern underwire brassiere or a heavy-duty athletic sports bra, distributing the heavy weight of massive, multi-layered skirts away from the spine and onto the hips. The practice of extreme tight lacing down to an impossibly tiny 16-inch waist did exist, but it was an incredibly rare, highly controversial fashion subculture pursued only by ultra-wealthy, elite socialites for brief evening galas, equivalent to modern celebrities wearing sky-high 6-inch stilettos on a red carpet. The pervasive fainting spells of the era were not caused by crushed ribs. They were the direct chemical result of abysmal indoor ventilation in gas-lit rooms combined with the toxic, arsenic-laced green wallpaper fumes that poisoned the air of every fashionable parlour in London. Our deconstruction crosses into the sacred halls of modern intellectual history to correct the comforting academic slander of myth number 41, the inspiring legend that Albert Einstein flunked his childhood mathematics classes, proving to struggling students everywhere that even the greatest genius in human history was once a failure at basic school subjects. This specific fable has been printed in motivational posters and narrated in biographical films for decades to comfort underachieving students. It is a complete and absolute biographical fabrication. The archival records of Einstein's early schooling in Switzerland reveal that he was an absolute mathematical prodigy from his earliest childhood, consistently scoring the highest possible marks in advanced mathematics, algebra, and physics. The entire myth originated from a simple, comical misunderstanding of the European grading scale. During his early schooling, the school utilized a grading system where the number 1 represented the highest possible grade. Midway through his education, the school board decided to invert the scale, making the number 6 the top mark and the number 1 the lowest. To a lazy biographer looking back at his old report cards without checking the academic key, it appeared as though the young genius had suddenly dropped from the top of his class straight down to an absolute failure, transforming an administrative change into a mythological learning disability. Finally, we arrive at the very cradle of American democracy to correct the calendar layout of myth number 42, the grand patriotic conviction that the signing of the United States Declaration of Independence took place in one grand, unified, and highly dramatic ceremony on July 4, 1776, with every single founding father stepping forward in a crowded, historic room to boldly scratch their name onto the parchment, while the Liberty Bell rang out above them. This pristine cinematic tableau is a mandatory set piece of historical dramas. In the dry, unromantic light of the Continental Congress journals, July 4th was merely the quiet calendar date on which the literal text of the document was formally approved by the delegates and sent to the local printer. The actual physical signing of the large parchment document didn't even begin until August 2nd, 1776, when a small group of delegates gathered to scratch their names. Many prominent members of the Congress weren't even in the city on that date. They trickled into Philadelphia weeks and months later, signing the document in near-empty rooms throughout the autumn, while some delegates didn't add their signatures until well into the following year. As we close the grand ledger on these 42 historical myths, the sweeping, deeply philosophical conclusion becomes starkly apparent. Human beings do not actually want the truth. We fundamentally prefer a beautifully packaged, emotionally manipulative cinematic lie over the messy, unglamorous, and cold realities of our shared human history. Real history is a complicated, grey landscape populated by flawed, highly pragmatic individuals who were simply trying to survive the economic and biological realities of their specific eras. But Hollywood is a dream factory, not a peer-reviewed academic textbook. Its primary commercial mandate is to sell tickets, satisfy our modern moral biases, and distill the immense chaos of human existence into a neat, 2-hour narrative arc with clean heroes and easily identifiable villains. If you step into a movie theater expecting an accurate education on the human condition, you are volunteering to be deceived. Treat the silver screen as simple theater, keep your critical instincts sharp, and never let a flashing projector do your historical thinking for you.